The storm had arrived with a sudden ferocity, turning the familiar village into a place of shadows and flickering lanterns. Rain lashed against the uneven rooftops, bouncing off the clay tiles in rapid, impatient rhythms. The wind tore through the narrow streets, scattering straw and debris in a chaotic dance that rattled shutters and made the few remaining trees bend with strained resilience. Within one small modest house at the edge of the village, the sound of hammering pierced the storm's roar, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the usual tranquility of the night. Nia stirred in her bed, the coarse blanket wrapped around her shoulders doing little to ward off the chill that had seeped through the walls. She had grown accustomed to the seasonal storms that swept through the hills, yet this night felt different. There was a rhythm to the hammering, a cadence of intent that made her pulse quicken, not with fear alone, but with the recognition of human malice. The nails bit into the wooden frame of her door with grating precision, each strike sending a small vibration through the floorboards beneath her feet. The smell of wet timber mixed with the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil outside, creating a tangible tension that seemed to wrap around her as tightly as her blankets. Slowly Nia rose, her bare feet finding the cold floor with measured care. The candlelight flickered across the walls, casting distorted shadows that trembled in concert with the wind's relentless push against the windows. Her heart beat in a steady rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the storm's wild crescendo. She had lived through hardships before, had learned the language of patience and observation, yet the deliberate act of her stepfamily's cruelty unsettled her in ways that went beyond simple fear. There was intent here, a desire to trap and control, and she understood that the house itself was attuned to her presence in ways few could comprehend. Moving toward the window, Nia peered through the latticed glass, watching as her stepmother's figure hunched over the door, hammer in hand. Two of her stepbrothers crouched nearby, holding the wooden plank steady as their mother drove nails deep into the frame. Their movements were quick, practiced, as though they had rehearsed this act of confinement many times in the recesses of their minds. The wind caught the loose strands of hair on Nia's stepmother's head, plastering them against her wet, glistening forehead. The rain clung to her stepbrother's skin in rivulets, yet they showed no hesitation, only the satisfaction of perceived dominance over the girl who had quietly resisted their authority for years. Nia's eyes did not waver. Her gaze followed the nails sinking into the wood, the sharp clicks resonating like a series of small alarms. She noted each strike, each measured thrust, her mind cataloging the sounds, the angles, the lengths of the boards being nailed. In the eerie interplay of storm and malice, she remained calm, her body still, her mind alert. She had long understood that fear could be a weapon used against her, that the very knowledge of her own vulnerability could be manipulated, and tonight she refused to succumb. The storm outside seemed to sense the tension within the small house. Gusts of wind rattled the windows more violently, and occasional lightning flashes revealed the wet sheen of the courtyard beyond. Rainwater streamed down the eaves in torrents, hammering the ground and forming rivulets that cut through the earth, carrying the scent of wet clay into the air. Each flash illuminated the malicious activity at the door in brief, stark clarity. Her stepfamily working in unison, their faces taut with determination and an almost gleeful cruelty. Nia felt the charge of the storm as if it were a pulse running through the house, a living entity that responded to her fearlessness with quiet strength. She placed her hand upon the wall near the door, feeling the dampness of the clay and the vibrations of the nails driven into the wood. The house groaned softly in response, timbers creaking as though in acknowledgement of her presence. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth rose from the floorboards, mingling with the chill in the air. It was a reminder that the house was more than mere wood and clay. It was a guardian, attuned to her heartbeat, her breathing, her subtle shifts in stance. Tonight, it would not let harm come to her without a struggle. The hammering slowed for a moment, then resumed with renewed intensity. Nia did not flinch, though a bead of rainwater slipped down her temple, tracing a path over her cheek. Her stepfamily worked with frantic precision, convinced that physical barriers could contain her spirit, her resilience. They failed to see the currents of power that flowed unseen through the walls, the silent acknowledgement of the storm outside that mirrored the vigilance of the home itself. The door may have been sealed in wood and nail, but the boundaries of Nia's protection extended far beyond simple locks or barriers. In the brief lulls between hammer strikes, the wind carried distant sounds from the village. A dog barking against the storm, the faint creak of other houses bending under the gusts, and the whispered voices of neighbors seeking shelter. Within her small, simple room, Nia drew a slow, deliberate breath, sensing the balance between danger and defense. The house, the storm, and her own steady awareness formed a triad of unseen forces that her stepfamily could neither anticipate nor control. Each nail hammered into the door only strengthened her resolve, each board secured as if it were a test of her composure and the house's loyalty. As the final nail was driven home, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, shaking the frame with violent insistence. Nia did not step back. She remained at the window, eyes sharp and unyielding, aware of the storm's embrace and the subtle pulse of the house beneath her palms. She understood, as she always had, that the intent behind the act of cruelty mattered as much as the act itself. The door might be sealed, but it could not imprison her courage, and the house, alive in its quiet vigilance, would not allow injustice to go unchecked. The night pressed in, heavy with rain, wind, and anticipation, yet Nia stood poised, a calm center in the storm, knowing that what began with malice could only end as the house willed it to. The mornings in Nia's village often began with a soft hush, a delicate pause before the clamor of daily life took hold. Before the sun rose fully over the jagged hills and the scattered clay houses, she would already be moving quietly through the small garden behind her home. Dew clung to the leaves, sparkling in the early light, and each plant seemed to respond to her gentle touch. Nia's fingers glided over the veins of the herbs and flowers as if she were reading their innermost needs. Lavender, sage, basil, and thyme, every plant was nurtured with care, and in return, they seemed to bloom brighter under her watchful eye. Her small plot was a mosaic of colors, textures, and scents, a haven of calm in a village often stirred by whispers and petty disputes. The villagers knew of Nia's skill. Farmers would sometimes leave bundles of soil or seeds at her doorstep, hoping for advice on their crops. Mothers brought sick children to her, relying on the subtle power she seemed to command over natural remedies. Her knowledge of herbs went beyond simple healing. She understood the timing of planting, the phases of the moon, and the moods of the weather. A subtle shift in the wind, a faint change in humidity, even the angle of sunlight through the hills, Nia could sense these things and use them to guide her work. Her calm, steady demeanor reassured those who came to her, and even the youngest children would linger in her garden, watching her hands move like water over the soil, learning without words. Yet her quiet life was not without its burdens. Her stepfamily, living in a larger, more ostentatious house closer to the center of the village, watched her with thinly veiled resentment. Her stepmother's eyes often followed Nia's movements through the morning haze, narrowing at the sight of neighbors nodding in respect or smiling at Nia's courteous greetings. The girls in the village would sometimes whisper among themselves, admiring the way her hair caught the sunlight, the way she moved through the gardens as though she were part of the plants themselves. Her stepmother perceived these small acts of admiration as slights, as evidence that Nia believed herself above her station. Her stepbrothers echoed the sentiment in their own way, mocking Nia's routines, her attention to detail, and the careful, deliberate rhythm she maintained even in mundane chores. Despite the resentment surrounding her, Nia's days remained grounded in purpose. She rose before dawn to tend the soil, carefully mixing compost with earth to enrich it for the seedlings. She would collect water from the village well, pouring it gently over roots and leaves, listening to the subtle sound as it soaked into the ground. Sometimes she would hum softly, a melody learned from her mother long ago, and the plants seemed to respond, their leaves stretching as though reaching for the tune. She had a small window in her kitchen where sunlight poured in, and she arranged her seeds in pots there, allowing the warmth to encourage growth. Every motion was deliberate, every action a testament to her patience and understanding of the natural world. The villagers' respect for Nia was quiet but genuine. Elderly men would nod at her when she passed on the road, silently acknowledging her wisdom. Mothers whispered her name to one another when discussing remedies or ways to soothe their children. Even merchants from neighboring villages would pause to exchange greetings, leaving behind small gifts of rare seeds or medicinal plants. She did not demand attention or recognition, yet it was freely offered, a tribute to the quiet authority that came from knowledge, patience, and an unwavering connection to life itself. Nia's stepfamily, in contrast, was a study in contrast. Their house, closer to the center of the village, was adorned with bright paints and the occasional gilded ornament. They sought attention through noise and ostentation rather than the steady diligence that defined Nia's life. Her stepmother's beauty, while more traditionally celebrated, was a mask for envy that twisted her thoughts whenever she witnessed Nia's harmony with the villagers. Her stepbrothers tried to assert dominance through loud laughter and rough behavior, attempting to undermine Nia with taunts or acts of petty cruelty. Yet each attempt met with her serene composure, her quiet strength and invisible shield that left their efforts looking clumsy and desperate. There was a rhythm to Nia's life that the village could sense. Even the animals seemed attuned to her presence. Chickens clucked softly around her feet, cats brushed against her legs without fear, and the dogs, often restless and protective, seemed calmed by her passing. She understood their moods and movements, treating each creature with respect and attention. Her abilities were subtle, woven into the fabric of daily existence, yet they carried a power that was easily recognizable to those who took the time to observe. The stepfamily's envy stemmed not only from admiration but from the fear that they could never replicate her effortless authority, her quiet command over life and nature. Nia's connection to the weather, to the earth, and to those around her gave her a resilience few could comprehend. When the wind shifted, she would adjust her garden's small windbreaks. When rain threatened to wash away her carefully planted seeds, she would dig channels to redirect the water gently. She anticipated problems before they occurred, guided by intuition sharpened over years of quiet observation. This foresight, coupled with her calm resolve, made her a figure of respect and mild awe. Yet it also fueled resentment, for the stepfamily could only see that others looked to her for guidance, while they struggled to command even attention through force or coercion. Though her life seemed simple, it was filled with subtle mastery. Nia moved through her days with grace, balancing work, care, and observation. She spent hours tending seedlings, weaving herbal bundles, and preparing remedies, yet she did so without urgency or complaint. Her life was a study in quiet perseverance, in the art of harmonizing with the rhythms of the earth and the people around her. Her stepfamily's jealousy, growing with each passing day, was a silent counterpoint to the peaceful cadence of her life, a tension waiting to erupt, for even the most serene strength can provoke fear and envy in hearts unaccustomed to humility. And so, in the calm before the storm, Nia's life unfolded, a life rooted in patience, knowledge, and an unseen power that came from harmony with nature and with herself. It was this very strength, this quiet authority, that would soon awaken the house's protective spirit, transforming the malice of her stepfamily into a lesson they could never forget. The villagers admired her, the earth responded to her, and though envy simmered around her, Nia remained unshaken, a serene force amid the turbulence of both human and natural elements. The shadows in the stepmother's house stretched long across the walls as evening settled over the village. In the dim glow of a flickering lamp, her sons leaned close, voices low but urgent, weaving together grievances that had festered for years. Each word dripped with envy, each glance toward the window where Nia's modest home rested across the courtyard was laced with resentment. They spoke of her skill with herbs, the way villagers sought her advice, the quiet authority she commanded without ever raising her voice. To them it was not admiration, it was a threat. The influence she wielded, gentle though it was, cast a shadow over their own attempts at dominance, and their mother's eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction as she listened. "You see how the neighbors nod when she walks past?" the eldest son whispered, his tone a mix of awe and irritation. "They listen to her like she owns the village. And for what? A few herbs and a calm voice." Their stepmother, perched near the fire, fingers interlaced tightly, allowed a small, calculating smile. Her envy had been growing silently over the years, stoked by each act of kindness Nia performed that drew the attention her own children craved. "It is not just her skills," she murmured, her voice soft yet cutting, "it is the respect she commands without asking for it. That respect should belong to us. It is ours by right." Her words stoked the embers of the sons' discontent, giving form to the feelings that had long simmered in their hearts. They spoke of petty slights, Nia greeting the village elders first, children laughing at her jokes instead of theirs, neighbors discreetly leaving gifts of herbs or produce at her door. Each incident, no matter how small, was catalogued and magnified in their minds, building a case in their shared imagination that she had to be subdued, controlled, or removed entirely. A hush fell over the room as the youngest son added, "What if we just confine her? Lock her away for a night perhaps. Let her see what it feels like to be powerless for once." His suggestion hung in the air, heavy with possibility and danger. The stepmother's eyes glimmered at the idea, her mind already racing through the logistics of turning the thought into action. To her, this was not cruelty for its own sake, it was a reclamation of authority, a demonstration to the village and her own family that Nia's quiet power had limits, and that she could be subdued if challenged. They leaned over maps of the small courtyard and the thin, winding paths that led to Nia's home. Every approach was considered, every potential obstacle discussed with meticulous care. The stepmother instructed her sons to wait for the cover of night, when the village would be asleep and the streets deserted. Their steps would be silent, their actions decisive. Even the locks on the door and the nails that would secure it were part of her careful orchestration, a statement of dominance cloaked as a practical measure. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the shutters and making the firelight dance across the walls in jittering patterns. It seemed to echo the tension within the plotting room, a natural accompaniment to the human malice being prepared. The stepmother spoke again, her voice almost hypnotic in its intensity. "We do this once, and the girl will learn. She will understand that her gifts, her influence, mean nothing without our permission. And if she resists," she let the threat linger, unspoken but understood. Her sons nodded, a mixture of fear and excitement in their eyes. The eldest son's hand brushed against the hammer resting on the table, a tool that would soon enforce their mother's will. The middle son traced the outline of the doorframe in his mind, imagining Nia trapped inside, powerless and silent. Even the youngest, though hesitant, could not resist the thrill of being part of the plan, of finally asserting control over the girl who had long overshadowed them with quiet strength. All around them, the storm outside intensified as if the village itself sensed the brewing malice. Rain began to beat harder against the rooftops, wind shrieking through the narrow streets, shaking shutters and rattling loose tiles. Yet inside the plotting room, the stepmother and her sons were oblivious to the storm's warning. Their focus was entirely on Nia, the girl who smiled at the wind and the soil alike, the girl whose quiet life had become unbearable to them because of the calm influence she held over those around her. By the time darkness fully enveloped the village, the plan had solidified. Every whispered word, every glinting glance toward the door, every shared smirk of malice had laid the foundation for the act they believed would assert their dominance. They would nail the door shut, and in doing so, they would confine not only Nia's body but, they imagined, her spirit. They could not foresee, however, that the very walls of her home, attuned to her presence and to the subtle harmonies of her life, were already awake and waiting, ready to challenge the cruelty that dared to enter her space. Outside the stepmother's house, the first warning of the coming tempest arrived as a low, rolling rumble in the distance, like a drumbeat echoing across the hills. The wind, initially playful and teasing, began to gather strength, rustling leaves, shaking shutters, and tugging at loose tiles with an almost sentient persistence. In the courtyard, the stepmother and her son stood in grim satisfaction, convinced that their plan to trap Nia behind the nailed door had gone off without a hitch. Their smirks and whispered laughter betrayed their arrogance. In their minds, the girl was powerless, confined, and entirely at their mercy. The sky above darkened swiftly, the sun swallowed behind thick, oppressive clouds that churned with growing intensity. Each cloud seemed alive, swelling and twisting as though stirred by an unseen hand. Occasional flashes of lightning cut across the horizon, momentarily illuminating the anxious faces of villagers who had begun noticing the unusual darkening. Rain began to fall in sporadic bursts, sharp and cold, tapping on the rooftops and splattering against the earth. The step-family paid little attention, dismissing these signs as a typical storm, a natural inconvenience rather than a warning. "Let her sweat a little," the eldest son said, brushing raindrops from his face with an impatient hand. "She'll learn her place soon enough." His words dripped with cruelty, yet even he could not ignore the way the wind now hissed through the narrow streets, bending trees and shaking fence posts with unnatural vigor. The middle son chuckled nervously, gripping the handle of a hammer, imagining the small, trapped figure of Nia on the other side of the nailed door. The youngest, less confident, shivered as a sudden gust sent a shiver down his spine, yet he forced a smile, mirroring the bravado of his elder siblings. As the storm grew, so did the weight of the clouds, hanging heavy over the village like a dark, watching presence. Thunder rolled again, closer now, vibrating through the earth and rattling the doors of nearby homes. Each flash of lightning revealed the chaos in miniature, the trembling leaves, the bending branches, the reflection of fear in the eyes of livestock huddled against the wind. Villagers scurried indoors, clutching belongings and covering their heads, murmuring prayers to gods they had long neglected, sensing a power in the storm that exceeded mere weather. Yet the stepfamily's confidence remained unshaken. They laughed at the villagers' fussing, convinced that the elements were simply inconvenient companions to their plan. "A little rain won't hurt her," the stepmother said, brushing wet hair from her forehead. "She's locked away. We hold the power here." But even as she spoke, the air seemed to thicken around them. The rain intensified, heavier now, drumming relentlessly against the tiled roof, and the wind whipped with a new ferocity, rattling the shutters and bending the saplings at the edge of the courtyard. It was no longer a storm they faced, it was a rising force, impatient and growing, as if the elements themselves had been called to attention. Nia, unseen and calm behind the nailed door, felt the vibrations through the floor and walls. Each tremor of the house, each gust rattling the timbers, resonated with her heartbeat. She did not panic, She had known storms, had weathered them many times while tending her garden and reading the skies. But she recognized the difference. The tempest approaching now was not merely a natural occurrence. It was a response, subtle yet undeniable, to the injustice imposed upon her. Every nail driven into her door, every cruel word whispered by her stepfamily, had set in motion a force they could not comprehend. Lightning split the sky in sudden brilliance, illuminating the courtyard in stark white for a fraction of a second. The stepmother and her sons froze, a brief flicker of unease crossing their features, quickly replaced by forced bravado. "See," the eldest son said, laughing too loudly. "It is nothing but weather. She cannot control this." But the wind, as though mocking his arrogance, roared louder, whipping loose debris across the yard and rattling the nails in the very door they had hammered shut. Rainwater pooled around their feet, soaking their shoes, and the storm's growl seemed to echo their own fear back to them in a distorted, mocking tone. Even as they jeered and mocked, the first tangible signs of the house's protection began to manifest. The wood of the door groaned and shuddered as if alive, responding to the shifting air and gathering energy of the storm. Small cracks ran along the frame where none had existed before, not from rot but from something far more potent, unseen yet unmistakable. The stepfamily laughed nervously at the sound, dismissing it as strain from the weather, unaware that the house itself had begun to awaken, aligning with Nia's calm resolve and unseen power. The storm now raged in full force, clouds swirling with electric intensity, wind tearing along the hills and rain cascading in relentless sheets. The village, once bustling with evening activity, had emptied as fear of the tempest drove people indoors. Yet in the courtyard, the stepmother and her sons remained, their arrogance blinding them to the growing signs of a force beyond human control. The elements around them were no longer simply weather, they were a herald, a harbinger of justice, coiling and twisting in anticipation of what was to come, ready to defend the girl they had sought to confine. Inside the small, sturdy house, the storm outside was deafening, yet Nia felt an unusual serenity. The walls, built from sun-baked clay and timber, had long been her silent companions, holding memories of her quiet life and the care she put into every corner. Now they were more than just shelter, they were allies. The energy of the house, attuned to her calm resolve and the injustice inflicted upon her, began to stir subtly, responding to the malice at its doorstep. As rain battered the roof and wind shrieked through the shutters, the walls themselves seemed to shift imperceptibly. Floorboards creaked and timber joints groaned, not from weakness but as though the house was drawing itself tighter, preparing to repel the intruders. Nia, seated cross-legged near the hearth, felt the vibrations through the floor beneath her. Her senses, honed from years of tending herbs and reading subtle omens in the wind, detected the protective presence of the home. Every pulse of the storm, every gust pressing against the clay walls, resonated with her calm heartbeat. Outside, the stepmother and her sons pounded on the door, hammers striking nails with brutal insistence. Each blow seemed to trigger a reaction within the house itself. The door shuddered under the assault, but the frame subtly shifted, the edges tightening like the grip of an unseen hand. The stepmother's eldest son pushed harder, his face contorted with effort and frustration. "Why isn't it breaking?" he shouted, the first flicker of doubt crossing his eyes. The youngest son looked on uneasily, feeling a strange pressure against his chest, as if invisible walls had begun to push back. Inside, Nia remained perfectly still, her breathing even and composed. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the house respond more vividly to her calmness than to the storm itself. The clay walls seemed to pulse with life, fibers of timber contracting and releasing as though inhaling and exhaling with her. The air within the home grew warmer, tinged with a faint scent of her herbs and the soil from which the house was built. It was as if the structure itself recognized the injustice of the nails driven into her door, the attempts to confine her against her will, and now prepared to defend its occupant. The first shift was subtle but undeniable. The floorboards beneath the stepmother's feet outside heaved slightly, enough to throw her balance off. She stumbled, cursing under her breath, and slammed the hammer again, but the house's resistance had begun. The walls creaked louder now, as if warning the intruders, tightening in sympathy with Nia's resolve. Each strike against the door seemed to feed the house's awareness, making it firmer, unyielding, alive. From the inside, Nia could feel the protective energy coiling through the walls, like tendrils of unseen force preparing to act. Her connection with the structure was almost instinctual, the result of years of care and attention she had poured into every corner of the home. She had tended the clay, reinforced the timber, and arranged the hearth with love and intention. Now that same intention resonated, amplifying the house's ability to defend her. She allowed herself a small, serene smile, knowing that the malice outside would meet a force far greater than simple human strength. The stepmother, oblivious to the subtle defenses, redoubled her efforts, hammering with reckless fervor. Each strike seemed only to trigger more pronounced reactions. The doorframe pulsed, the walls creaked in rhythmic protest, and the nails vibrated under the unyielding grip of the structure. The eldest son shouted in frustration, slamming his fist against the wood, but even his brute force could not overcome the house's resolve. The wind outside roared as if cheering the home's defense, driving rain in sheets that obscured the courtyard and made their footing slippery. Inside, the house continued its silent countermeasures. The floorboards shifted just enough to unbalance those pressing against the door. The windows rattled violently, scattering raindrops across the interior as if warning intruders to step back. Nia, calm and centered, felt the energy coalesce around her, a tangible shield of protective intent. She did not move, did not shout, did not threaten. The house acted on her behalf, responding directly to the harmony she had cultivated within its walls. As the storm raged, the stepmother and her sons began to falter. Their confidence, once unwavering, wavered as they felt pressure against their bodies that had no visible source. The eldest stumbled, the youngest froze, and the middle son's hands slipped repeatedly on the hammer handle. Panic began to creep into their eyes, unacknowledged at first but growing with every subtle heave and creak from the house. They could not comprehend the force opposing them. The malice that had seemed so simple to enforce now met a living resistance, and the storm outside seemed to amplify it, wind and rain merging with the structure's own intent. By the time the first true gust of wind slammed against the walls, the stepmother's pride had begun to crumble. The house was no longer just a building, it was an extension of Nia herself, resilient, calm, and aware. Every creak, every pulse of timber, every tightening seam communicated a single truth: the intruders would not prevail. Nia, serene and grounded, sensed that her home, attuned to her spirit, was more than ready to repel the injustice brought to its door. The stepmother's patience snapped as the pounding on the door seemed futile. Frustration turned to desperation, and she barked orders to her sons. If the door won't give, then we'll find another way in. Windows, walls, nothing can hide her from us. The eldest son, hammer still in hand, glared at the shutters with growing unease. Lightning flashed, illuminating the courtyard and casting eerie shadows that seemed to exaggerate the movements of their frantic efforts. They moved first to the windows, prying at shutters and pushing against the wooden frames with brute force. Each attempt to break the glass was met with surprising resistance. The panes didn't shatter as expected. Instead, they rattled violently as if pushed back from within. Fingers slipped across slick surfaces, and small rivulets of rainwater pooled along the sills, making the ground slippery. The middle son swore, wiping rain from his brow, his arrogance faltering as he realized the windows were not merely barriers. They seemed alive, bending and resisting his every push. Inside, Nia remained calm, seated cross-legged on the floor with her hands folded in her lap. She could feel the tension in the walls, the subtle shifts as they responded to the intruder's aggression. Timber beams creaked, floors groaned, and furniture nudged ever so slightly, rearranging itself in ways that hindered entry. A small chair toppled in the corner, an end table shifted, and even the heavy rug seemed to rise against the weight of the stepfamily's intrusion. Nia didn't touch a thing. She needed only to remain composed, and the house would act on her behalf. The stepmother's youngest son attempted a more reckless approach, clawing at the clay wall near the corner of the house. His fingers dug into the soft material, expecting to create a breach. Instead, the wall seemed to press outward against his hands, holding firm and shifting subtly to throw him off balance. He stumbled backward, landing in the slick mud outside. The rainwater had soaked the courtyard thoroughly, and his footing betrayed him as he scrambled to rise. Each failed attempt added to their growing panic. The house did not merely resist, it actively impeded them. A bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a rumble of thunder that vibrated through the walls. The eldest son glared at the door once more, then back at the windows. "It's just the storm making things difficult," he muttered, though doubt had begun to creep into his voice. The middle son, drenched and shivering, kicked at the doorframe and tried to pull at a window. Each time, the house responded. The floorboards shifted slightly, furniture nudged outward, and rainwater pooled unpredictably, turning the earth beneath their feet into a treacherous trap. Even a small garden bench, left untouched for months, toppled over as if pushed by unseen hands, blocking their path to the window. Inside, Nia sensed the house's rhythm perfectly. Every push, Every pull, every attempt to breach the walls was met with a coordinated response. The furniture shifted just enough to slow progress, the rainwater made each step uncertain, and the timber joints subtly adjusted, resisting pressure at precisely the right moments. The walls themselves creaked and groaned in a protective cadence, a song of warning and defiance that the step family could neither hear nor understand. Nia's presence was calm, her focus absolute, and the house responded with intelligence born from her own steady will. The stepmother, growing increasingly frantic, tried a final tactic. She grabbed a heavy rod and began pounding along the outer walls, trying to break through by brute force. Each strike was met with resistance far beyond what wood and clay should provide. The rod bounced slightly, the walls pressing back subtly yet forcefully, forcing her to stagger backward with every blow. Her sons followed suit, slamming and prying with all their might, but each movement only caused more instability beneath their feet. Rainwater had now pooled into small streams, creating treacherous footing that sent them slipping and grasping at one another for balance. Moments of panic replaced their earlier arrogance. The youngest son whispered nervously, "This isn't normal, nothing is working, it's like the house is alive." The stepmother scowled, dismissing his fear, but even she could not ignore the strange vibrations that ran through the floor and walls. Timber groaned under pressure, clay bulged subtly, and every attempt at entry was met with coordinated resistance. The storm outside roared as if echoing the house's defiance, and lightning illuminated the scene, casting ghostly reflections on the wet courtyard. By the time the storm reached its peak, the stepfamily was drenched, exhausted, and increasingly aware that the house, and perhaps Nia herself, was far more than it seemed. Their arrogance had dissolved into panic. The walls had shifted, the furniture had obstructed their path, and the rain had turned the ground into a treacherous trap. Each attempt to force entry only reinforced the house's dominance, a tangible manifestation of protection aligned with Nia's calm and righteous spirit. As the storm raged on, the stepmother and her sons felt the first true seeds of fear take root. What had begun as frustration over a nailed door now escalated into something far more sinister and inexplicable. The walls of Nia's home, sturdy and sun-baked, were no longer passive barriers. They seemed alive, reacting to their every move with deliberate intent. Every step they took toward the windows or corners was met with resistance. Timber beams shifted subtly, floorboards heaved beneath them, and furniture blocked their paths as if guided by unseen hands. The youngest son stumbled backward as a chair toppled in his path, narrowly avoiding a slip into a shallow puddle forming from the relentless rain. He scrambled to regain his balance, only to find the walls themselves tightening slightly, narrowing the narrow corridor they tried to navigate. Panic surged through him and he whispered urgently, "Mother, the house, it's..." But his voice was drowned by the roar of the storm outside, the thunder shaking the very earth beneath their feet. The stepmother's face, once red with anger and determination, now paled under the harsh flashes of lightning. Each bolt illuminated the chaos, casting her shadow across the wet courtyard in grotesque, stretched forms. She had always believed herself clever, able to manipulate and dominate Nia with threats and malice. But now, confronted by a force beyond her understanding, her confidence crumbled. The walls themselves seemed to press outward subtly, nudging her back and making each step forward a struggle. The middle son attempted to shove a window open, hissing through gritted teeth, but the frame resisted with unnatural firmness. Rainwater spilled over the sill, soaking his hands and making the glass slick. When he tried again, the floor beneath him shifted imperceptibly, causing him to lose balance. He fell against a wooden beam and the sudden creak echoed like a warning. He froze, eyes wide with the realization that this was no ordinary house, no ordinary defense. Every movement seemed anticipated, every effort thwarted by an unseen intelligence aligned with Nia. Outside, the villagers had gathered at a safe distance, umbrellas bent under the force of the wind, eyes wide with disbelief. Lightning flashed across the darkened sky, illuminating the frantic figures at Nia's door and windows. Some whispered prayers, others muttered nervously about the girl's supposed powers, and a few, more skeptical, could not deny what they were seeing. A house that moved with purpose, defending its occupant against malicious intruders. Gasps and cries punctuated the storm, each flash of lightning revealing a new detail. The stepmother being nudged back by the walls, the son stumbling, water pooling at odd angles, furniture subtly rearranging itself to block them. The eldest son, usually the most confident, pounded his fists against the timber with growing desperation. "Get out of the way," he shouted to his siblings, but the walls continued to press, subtly, almost playfully, keeping them at bay. Every attempt at aggression was met with counter-pressure. Every lunge forward was met with a shift beneath their feet or a nudge from the walls that sent them stumbling into one another. The storm outside amplified the tension, gusts of wind rattling shutters, sheets of rain forming miniature rivers along the clay courtyard. The stepmother's voice rose in panic, demanding compliance and begging the house to relent, though she did not know how to speak to such a force. Her sons mirrored her fear, their earlier arrogance replaced by terror and disbelief. The walls creaked in response, expanding and contracting as if to remind them that they were intruders in a space aligned entirely with Nia's presence. It was no longer about human strength. The house itself had taken on agency, an extension of her calm resolve, and it was asserting dominance with subtle, terrifying precision. As minutes dragged on, the stepfamily's resistance began to falter. Their movements grew sluggish, cautious, every glance over a shoulder revealing the storm's chaotic backdrop. Lightning illuminated the surreal scene, a mother and her sons flailing, blocked by walls, slipping on wet surfaces and unable to advance. The villagers watched, holding their breath, some whispering that the house itself was enchanted, that Nia's quiet spirit had awakened a power capable of defending her against injustice. Fear had fully taken root now. The stepmother shrieked as a wall seemed to press more insistently, forcing her back toward the courtyard. Her sons, soaked and shivering, could no longer maintain their composure. The house, attuned to Nia's calm and protective presence, continued to nudge, push, and obstruct them, each movement precise, deliberate, and unyielding. The storm raged in perfect sync with the house's actions, thunder rolling as if to punctuate the growing panic. By the time the first real hour of the storm passed, the stepmother and her sons were fully overwhelmed. Their arrogance was replaced entirely by terror. The walls had made their intent clear. They would not allow harm to come to Nia, and any attempt to breach her sanctuary would be met with resistance powerful enough to throw them into chaos, if not to the ground entirely. The storm in the house, in perfect harmony, had asserted their will, leaving the antagonists shaken, wet, and deeply afraid. Nia sank to the floor, her back resting against the warm, timbered wall of her home, and exhaled slowly. Outside, the storm still raged, lashing the village with wind and rain, rattling shutters and whipping dust and debris through the streets. Inside, however, a serene calm enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chaos just beyond the walls. She traced her fingers across the smooth surface of the wooden floor, feeling the subtle vibrations that hinted at the house's sentience, as if it had recognized her need for safety and had taken up the mantle of guardian on her behalf. The ordeal of the past hours had been intense, yet Nia felt no fear lingering within her. The house had moved, shifted, and resisted with a precision that mirrored her own steady pulse. It was as though the walls themselves breathed in harmony with her calm heart, stretching and contracting subtly, guiding the intruders into missteps and keeping her unharmed. Each floorboard, each beam, each shutter had acted with intelligence, not merely as wood and clay, but as extensions of her patience and quiet power. Settling deeper into a corner near the hearth, Nia let her mind drift, reflecting on her life before the stepfamily's jealousy had reached its violent peak. She remembered mornings tending her small garden, noting the subtle shifts in the wind, watching how the plants bent in response to rain, how the soil held moisture and life. She remembered afternoons crafting herbal remedies for the villagers, quiet moments where her skills were appreciated, and even small, polite nods of respect from those who suspected there was more to her than simple domestic skill. It was in these acts, small, deliberate, and careful, that she had cultivated patience, a strength that had now manifested through her home's protective spirit. The house itself seemed to respond to her reflection, groaning softly in acknowledgement. A loose shutter rattled, not violently but rhythmically, almost like a deep, reassuring exhale. The walls shifted subtly, their timber framing creaking with a language she had learned to feel rather than hear. Each vibration was a word, each movement a sentence. You are safe. You are protected. Harm cannot enter here while your spirit remains steady. Nia's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at her lips, for she understood the depth of this communion. The house was not merely shelter, it was an extension of her essence, a companion whose loyalty was born of the same quiet harmony that she carried within herself. Her thoughts turned to the stepmother and her sons, trapped outside in the storm, pushed and shoved by walls that bent with intent. Nia did not feel triumph, there was no joy in their fear. Instead, she felt a deep understanding of justice, of balance restored. Those who sought to harm with cruelty had met resistance precisely calibrated to their intent. The protective spirit of the house did not act recklessly. It mirrored her calm, her measured strength, responding to the storm of malice with order and precision. Nia's gaze wandered to the windows, through which sheets of rain and flashes of lightning illuminated the courtyard. The storm continued to rage, yet not a drop of harm had touched her. She could feel the energy of the house coursing through every beam and plank, a living force that bent in cooperation with her will. The walls weren't merely solid, they were responsive, almost sentient, guided by a quiet intelligence that she had cultivated in herself over years of patience, observation, and quiet endurance. As the hours passed, Nia thought of the villagers who had long admired her quietly, though some harbored envy. She considered the lessons she had imparted without words: patience in the face of adversity, kindness even when threatened, and the quiet cultivation of skills and virtues that could never be taken by force. The house, in its silent vigilance, embodied these lessons in physical form, protecting her in a way that was both practical and symbolic. She allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of her heart align with the subtle groans and vibrations of the house. The storm might rage, the wind might howl, and the stepmother might seethe, but within these walls there was harmony. Each creak, each shift of the timber, each gentle nudge of a floorboard or shutter was a reassurance, a testament to the balance she had maintained in her life and the protective power that patience and quiet strength could summon. As night deepened, Nia remained seated, calm and centered. She reflected on her journey, on the small acts of perseverance that had led to this moment, on the way she had nurtured her connection to the house, to the earth, to the quiet forces that had always watched over her. The house was alive in a way that was inseparable from her, its protective spirit a constant companion that amplified her resolve and mirrored her grace. When the storm finally began to wane, and the first hints of dawn brushed the horizon, Nia rose slowly. The walls had remained vigilant through the night, a silent testament to the partnership she had fostered with them. She moved through the house, touching each surface gently, feeling the lingering energy of protection, and offering a silent thanks. For Nia, the experience was not merely one of survival, but a profound recognition of her own quiet power and the harmony that allowed the house to act as guardian, protector, and witness to her resilience. The stepmother's eyes widened in panic as the floor beneath her shifted subtly, nudging her toward the door she had so arrogantly thought would confine Nia. She stumbled, reaching out for the walls, the table, anything solid, but every surface seemed to resist her grip, tilting or sliding just enough to deny purchase. The wind outside had grown into a raging force, whistling through cracks, flinging rain like sharp needles against her skin. Her screams were almost swallowed by the roar of the storm, but the terror in her eyes was unmistakable, raw and unrelenting. She tried to command her sons to help, her voice cracking with desperation. "Hold me. Stop this," she cried, but her sons themselves were being corralled by the walls, struggling to keep balance as the house itself seemed to push and shove with a will of its own. Every step she took toward resistance was met with gentle but firm pressure, the walls shifting subtly, a silent but inexorable force guiding her toward the open doorway. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face twisted in disbelief and fear. The storm outside was no longer just weather, it was an extension of the house's intent, a chaotic accompaniment to the methodical precision of Nia's home. Rain hammered her back and shoulders, soaking her clothing and blinding her partially, while gusts of wind ripped at her hair and cloak, pushing her further and further out. She screamed, trying to turn back, to resist, but the walls, alive, sentient in their subtle ways, offered no quarter. As she crossed the threshold, the house seemed to tighten slightly behind her, as if exhaling the intruder into the storm with purpose. The rain lashed at her face, stinging her eyes, while the wind tugged at her arms, legs, and hair with relentless strength. She struggled, planting her feet in the mud, but every step forward felt as though she were being guided by invisible hands, forced to confront the consequences of her cruelty. Her shouts were futile, carried away by the howling storm, leaving only the rhythmic beat of rain and the sharp cracks of thunder as witnesses to her terror. Mud and water soaked her feet as she slid across the uneven terrain just beyond the porch. The walls of the house loomed behind her, unmoving yet powerful in their intent, as if they were pushing her further into the storm with each gust. She tried to scramble for a tree or any semblance of shelter, but the elements conspired against her. Branches whipped her back, slippery soil betrayed her footing, and the wind howled in defiance of her frantic movements. Her heart pounded violently, adrenaline mixing with genuine terror. Every instinct screamed to flee, to escape, yet no amount of struggling could overcome the coordinated forces acting against her. The house, in perfect harmony with Nia's calm, patient presence inside, ensured that the stepmother experienced the full force of the storm, learning firsthand the futility of cruelty. Each shove, each gust of wind, Each flash of lightning emphasized that the powers she had sought to manipulate were far beyond her understanding. By the time the stepmother tumbled onto a slick patch of mud, exhausted and drenched, she was no longer merely facing a storm. She was facing the manifestation of Nia's patience, quiet power, and the house's protective will, a combined force that left no room for arrogance or resistance. The rain continued to pelt her back, the wind tore at her hair and garments, and the thunder rolled like a judgment she could not escape. The realization dawned slowly and painfully. The house had acted with precision, pushing her into the storm not randomly, but with an intent that mirrored the moral balance she had tried to disrupt. Every flailing movement she made only seemed to satisfy the rhythm of the house and storm working together. Her cries for mercy went unheard, drowned out by the elements and the subtle authority of Nia's domain. In that terrifying moment, the stepmother understood fully that her actions, born of jealousy, malice and greed, had consequences she could neither foresee nor resist. By the time she was finally swept a few yards from the threshold, mud-slick and rain-soaked, her fear had reached its apex. The storm's fury was both punishment and revelation, leaving her humbled, terrified, and utterly powerless. The villagers, watching from a distance through sheets of rain and shadowed by the flickering lightning, murmured among themselves. Some whispered about the girl inside, others about the strange, almost sentient house that had ejected the stepmother into the storm. Each flash of lightning illuminated the scene in sharp relief. A woman, formerly confident and cruel, now thrown into the elements by forces she could neither understand nor resist. And as she struggled against wind and water, it became painfully clear to all who watched that Nia's calm, patience and harmony with her home were powers beyond mere human reckoning.